So, Joan Cornacchio, I'm the Associate Director for SDMNY, Supported Decision Making New York. I've been with the project since its inception in 2016. We have a lot to share this morning. It's been a very exciting journey going from our first 5 years under the DDPC with a grant to show proof of concept that supported decision making was a viable alternative to guardianship. And then we had a grant. We were given funding through the Ford Foundation and Taft and Farr Foundation during the height of the pandemic, so that we could continue our work. And because everything had slowed down, and now we are under the auspices of the OPWDD. From 2022 to 2025, we are developing we're in the process of developing a facilitation, training, and resource education center. It's a lot of words for folks throughout New York. Anyone with or eligible or currently receiving services for OPWDD with an intellectual or developmental disability is entitled to go through a facilitation process with SDMNY, and we will be talking about that this morning. I'm going to pass it over to Jenna, and then we'll get started. Jenna.
Thank you, Joan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jenna Lamb. I'm the Transition Specialist and Technical Assistance Coordinator at SDMNY. That doesn't fit all on a slide, but the Transition Committee meeting is the perfect place to present. So we're excited to be with you this morning, and I will jump right into the overview of today. And we have a lot of time today, so we're excited to have a lot of time for questions. So please do feel free to put those in the chat along the way. We may not see them right away, but we'll definitely have time at the end. So first, we're going to talk about supported decision-making versus guardianship and the way that we look at this, which is from a human rights perspective. We'll talk a bit about what supported decision-making is and the specific SDMNY process, and learn about the future of supported decision-making in New York State. So first, we'll start with what is guardianship, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it is a legal process by which the right and power to make decisions and enter into legal relationships is taken away from one person because of their alleged incapacity and given to another, the guardian. This often happens in New York through 17A, which was instituted in 1969 with that deinstitutionalization movement, and is meant to be indefinite and permanent, removes all legal rights from the person with IDD based on a determination of the lack of capacity to make decisions. So why do parents seek guardianship? There's many reasons. There's some misinformation out there that it's necessary for continued services or to continue participating in the IEP process. There's a belief that guardianship will protect their children and a concern that their loved one might not be ready to make big life decisions. And then third parties might refuse to provide services unless they're dealing with a guardian. So that's a very real, if SSI tells you you need guardianship, or that can be a very powerful voice in that discussion. But what we have seen is that since 17A, there's been a lot of changes in the landscape. The ADA, IDEA, the Rehab Act introduced this concept of the least restrictive environment. So there's been much broader availability of services and opportunities that promote inclusion and self-determination. And the disability rights movement has led to individuals with IDD advocating for their rights. So this is just all to say that we're in a different world now where students are growing up with the expectation of inclusion and to have the same rights as all their peers. So supported decision-making is an alternative to guardianship where people with IDD never lose those important rights, to contract, to vote, to work, to marry. We believe very strongly in the dignity of risk, that supported decision-making allows a person to take risks and learn from their choices. And if you're never able to make those choices, you don't learn from them. So it keeps you in this state of feeling like you can't make those decisions. Supported decision-making also provides enhanced support. With the supported decision-making agreement, you form a network of supporters that really can protect against exploitation. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works with the supporters and the agreement a little later. And once again, coming back to human rights, this is the core of everything, which is that people with IDD have a human right to make their own decisions. And that's really the inalienable right that we are aiming to protect here. So what is supported decision-making? And this is an important distinction because supported decision-making is a concept that can look like many different things. So we have this great quote from Bob Dinerstein. It's a series of relationships, practices, arrangements, and agreements of more or less formality and intensity designed to assist an individual with a disability to make and communicate to others decisions about the individual's life. So we'll talk, on the next slide, we have descriptions of some of these levels of formality. But really the idea here is that everybody gets support making decisions. And supported decision-making is a way of formalizing that. It can be totally informal. It can be invisible, natural supports. You are buying a new car and your brother's a car person, so you call them to ask for help. Could be informal, but with a supported decision-making agreement. Could be oral or written. And some states have these more informal written supported decision-making agreements. Then we have the formal facilitated SDMA. That's formalized through a facilitation process that results in a written and signed SDMA. And this is the current SDMNY model that we have been working with. And then the last level is legalized by statute. And that is when third parties are required to accept the decisions made by people with SDMAs. And we say this is the future New York State model. The regulations are in progress and should be released literally any day now. We're waiting on them, but we do have a statute that we'll also talk about more later in the presentation. Oh, and that later is now. Article 82 of the Mental Hygiene Law. This is the supported decision-making statute in New York State. It was passed in July 2022. Governor Hochul signed it into law, and it establishes supported decision-making as a valid alternative to guardianship. It's a less restrictive alternative. This means that decisions must be recognized by third parties, and when there is a signed formal SDMA that somebody has gone through the process, and that third parties must presume competence. It's very important that there is no capacity test, and we always get questions about who's eligible to make an agreement. We can talk a little bit more about that, but there is no level requirements to meet other than that it has to be voluntary and a person has to want to do it and they have to go through the process. What this statute also does is it protects against liability for the third parties. So when they recognize decisions made using SDMAs, they are protected against legal action, which is important for those third parties to feel better about decisions that they're accepting. They can't make that argument that, they can't accept this because they're worried about their own, they might be sued for malpractice or, whatever might result from accepting the decision. I'm going to turn it over to Joan to talk more about our specific facilitation process at SDMNY.
Thanks, Jenna. Thank you so much. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now that you've heard some background on supported decision-making and a little bit about the nuances of how decision-making with support is quite different from guardianship. But before we go there, I just want to highlight that beautiful definition that's somewhat academic, but I think beautiful, of Bob Dinnerstein's, when he talks about, a series of practices and agreements and relationships. And then Jenna took us through thinking about the different kinds of levels of agreements, some of them informal, as in natural supports, and some of them more formal. And then, of course, the SDMNY process. And as we go through this morning, I encourage you to think about in your own lives the levels of relationships, agreements, contracts, signed or oral agreements that we have with one another, and then think about folks with IDD and the opportunities to have those same mechanisms in place. So really, supported decision making really just highlights that we're all interdependent and rely on one another, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. So I just think that that's really a great way to kind of frame how we think about decision making, because we all receive support for decisions. So now let's talk a little bit about what actually happens in SDMNY. So we have a 3-phase process. We are the only facilitated process in the country that actually has such a deliberate and somewhat lengthy 6 to 9 month process for decision makers to go through. The first phase is really an opportunity for the decision maker to spend a meeting time, no more than an hour at a time, to really explore what decision making looks like for the individual. Now, think about an 18-year-old, a person in transition. This is we're talking about transition age youth here today. At any rate, most 18-year-olds are not the most practiced decision makers, whether they're neurodiverse or neurotypical, right? So really exploring what that means to an individual and working from a strengths-based and interest-based perspective, right? What do you like? What are you good at? What's interesting to you? What kinds of decisions do you already make for yourself? What are some easy decisions you make on your own? What are some harder decisions that maybe you want support for? What decisions do you feel like you want other people to make for you? And also then talking about the different ways of receiving support, right? So those are all really wonderful ways of getting to know and build rapport with a decision maker and get a sense of how and in what ways the individual thinks of themselves as a person in charge of their decisions. So when we first started out years ago, we didn't really think about ourselves as teaching decision making, but we really are. And we'll talk a little more about that. And Jenna will give you an update on some of the exciting curriculum that she's been doing with folks at Hostos Community College on decision making. So after a fair amount of time has been spent in phase 1 with just the decision maker and an assigned facilitator, the decision maker has an idea of who they want to choose for supporters. So supporters are invited to learn about SDMNY, kind of like what we're doing right now, educating about what actually SDMNY involves, what the roles of a supporter would be, and what the responsibilities would be to the decision maker. And also importantly, this concept of repositioning from a role of parent to supporter. It's a very, very different role. I'm a parent. I understand that when I'm talking to my daughter, who does have a developmental disability, and she's talking about decision making in her life, I have to, I'm always going to be the parent, but I have to put on my supporter hat to be there in a way that she wants me to be as the person supporting her for her decision making. So if you're a caregiver, a parent, a sibling, a provider, we do have folks that are providers that are end up being supporters for decision makers. Really looking at how is this role different, right? So once people are onboarded and are making a commitment to their roles and responsibilities and have a sense of what they will be, how and in what ways they'll be supporting, we move on to phase 3, which is the cool part when the agreement, the supported decision-making agreement, SDMA, gets created. It's a negotiated contract, takes several meetings, and then in the end, there's a signing ceremony. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so these are some of the important steps in decision-making. We could argue whether there are 5 steps, 6 steps, 7 steps, but these are more or less the kinds of steps that an individual goes through, any of us, in making a decision, usually an important decision. For decision makers, we talk about decisions you're making now, but also decisions you want to be making in the future. So first step is always to gather information about what you need or want for this decision, right? Understanding the information is a whole other concept, right? There's lots of information out there, but how are you going to understand it? Perhaps you need support for understanding that information. Then there's also the idea that there are different possibilities and alternatives, right? You might think you want to go down this particular route, say, let's call it option A, but there could be option B or C as well. And then really thinking about what the outcomes or the consequences are of the various options that one might choose. Finally, weighing the options to decide, and then communicating the decision to others. We put that in as a step because some decision makers might need some support for that, to actually communicate the decision and then also implement, carry out the decision, okay? So we can talk more about this, or you might have questions, and we can give some examples of steps in decision making a little later on, if you like. Next slide. Here's just an example of a decision making tool that we use to help decision makers map out different kinds of decisions. This is also something that has been valuable to use with actual supporters as well. So just to kind of show you a visual, these were sticky notes that were put into a slide and a deck of slides, and it was designed by one of our facilitators. Some of our best ideas come out of facilitators that have worked with decision makers in our process. I've worked with a decision maker whose family loved this idea so much that they blew it up, and it now sits on their wall near their work area in their apartment. So anytime Emma has a decision she wants to make, or there's a family decision, they go to this map. Next slide. All right, so this slide and the following slide is just an example of one of the tools that we use with decision makers, but it's a very important one because its title is something that this really leads into building a supported decision-making agreement. It's called the Big Four chart because it's got 4 very big concepts here. Which areas do you want support in? And they could be anything from health to work to money to education. And on the next slide, you'll see other options: housing, services, community access, relationships. Okay, so that's the which areas. Then there's the what kinds of support: gathering information, understanding information. Again, those same kinds of support that you saw on the mapping tool are here on this Big Four chart. The third Big Four is the who will be supporting you for different areas. And then finally, how do you want that support? And the how is really more about the logistics that are involved. So how often do you want to meet? Are you going to meet over FaceTime? Is this your cousin in California and you live in New York? And do you set up a Zoom meeting once a month to talk about support for decisions about different kinds of relationships? I'm making this up. We have people choosing all kinds of supporters for different areas. You might be thinking, well, who are the supporters? How does this work? Very often supporters, well, first of all, supporters are chosen by the decision maker. They're trusted individuals in the person's life. And they might have a particular expertise in a particular area or particular interest in supporting in a particular area. This Big Four chart is really instrumental to guiding us to helping to develop a supported decision-making agreement. Next slide. So I just want to pause for a second to see if you have any questions that are kind of looming at the moment. There are a few things in the chat. Let me see if I can see what we've got. Are there any questions at the moment, or is this more? Okay, Andrew, if you're from an organization providing services for adults with IDD and you're interested in presenting the services. Oh, it's not a question. Okay.
That was a plug for a future event.
Okay, great. Doesn't look like there's any questions at the moment. Okay, and maybe Andrew, maybe to support Jenna and I, maybe you can monitor the chat for us if questions do pop up. So I'm
no problem.
with phone numbers and things. All right, so this video that we're going to show right now, it's about 4 minutes long. It's Beth is a mom of a young man who has a supported decision-making agreement. He was one of the first in New York State to sign an agreement back in 2018. Thomas is an alum of the Cook School. And when Beth came to an information session on SDM&Y and learned about it and then brought home the information to Thomas, and Thomas got excited, they actually stopped the guardianship proceedings that they had already begun because they were so excited that there was an option. So without further ado, Jenna, if you'll click the link so we can hear Beth's voice on this. This is also available on our website.
My name is Beth. I'm a supporter and parent of a young man who's a ever-growing identity as a decision maker. And we've been lucky enough to be part of this supported decision-making New York project. Our son is now 20, has an intellectual and developmental disability. And we were lucky enough to be diverted towards supported decision-making right when we were at the cusp of actually pursuing guardianship. So it was really fortunate the project team came to our son Tom's program, and the minute we heard about it and began to have conversation with this great group, it felt like a big relief. We were able to take a deep breath because of the opportunities in this new model just seemed to resonate with us. We felt like he spent so much time trying to find his voice and not have an ongoing system that supported that, but rather took away his voice was something that we just kept trudging through because we were encouraged that was the safe thing we needed to do to protect our son, and to have now this other framework that actually supports all the work that he's been doing to be more of a decision maker, to honor that, and to have that so well facilitated. Just we're so grateful and happy about it. I think the big thing that we've noticed and are really excited about is to watch our son grow in the process, and for also all of us who are in his family and his supporters and our friends to actually re-examine how we are with him and how we have changed our perspectives to find different ways of supporting his identity as a decision maker, that he does have strengths in all of these different areas and ability to identify his preferences for people who are going to support him, that really only took place by this very high quality facilitation. So I don't think this is a I'm trying to think, I want to say from a policy perspective, this needs to be really well supported to make sure that it can be really successful, given that there's some quality facilitation built in. It's been a ongoing process. It did take time for my son to start identifying himself as a decision maker and understanding the pride and further development he had once that began. Was really exciting. And it really, I think, expanded our perspective for him, rather than starting to feel like as things were ending, that his world was constricting. And this has really changed our perspective, and I think has given him a platform to become just more and more of himself and have the opportunity to have that be supported. So thank you. We're really happy to be involved.
Do we have the slides back up here?
Yes.
All right. This is me.
We have one question in the chat. I don't know if this is a good stopping point for that or later.
Yes, this actually,
Sure, absolutely. Is this about medical and financial decisions?
Yeah, Mirandi Rodriguez Brown asks, looking for more specific info about medical decisions and financial.
Right. Mirandi, I saw that and I've taken note, and happy to talk about that. Those are, as we know, the two enormous areas that scare everybody and that everyone needs support for. To frame a little bit of a conversation around that, that Jenna and I can respond to, can you say more about what you're interested in knowing? Or do you have a particular scenario in mind? And if not, we can, okay. You can feel free to unmute if you care to.
Hi, sorry, I was typing. I forgot I could
Okay,
unmute.
that's all right. And it's really hard to see the chat when you have the screen up, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Yes, yes. Hi. Oh, sorry, that's my parrot. Oh, he decides to talk now. He's been quiet this whole time. Shh, shh,
That's
shh.
all right. We had a decision maker, Jenna knows very well because she facilitated him, and he had a couple of, I think they were parakeets in his house. And they showed up at the signing ceremony even. So we're very familiar with birds.
Yes, yes. Sorry, he's an African gray, so you might hear him talking in the background. So my son has a seizure condition.
Sure.
He's on the autism spectrum. And his seizure condition began at the end of 2017, where we've been going back and forth navigating that. He's now on his fourth medication. A lot of times when we go to the doctors, of course, they understand that he's on the spectrum, and so they naturally defer to discussion, with me. But just concerned about things like that. There are a lot of times where my son typically does not ask a whole lot of questions regarding that. More often than not, he just sort of leaves it to my husband and I to sort of take care of that for him.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, of course, I guess I don't know. I mean, I'm just beginning to explore this whole process. I mean, my husband and I were looking into guardianship initially. I did not know that this program was a thing until Andrew sent me the email. And so we're just very much in the beginning of this whole process. He has a year and a half left in his program before he ages out at 22. So there's a lot of discussion that we're having. We just had a meeting with Andrew to discuss options for transition, and it's basically a beginning conversation for us. I'm a fish out of water. I don't even know where to start with this, really.
Yes. So thank you so much Randy, for your speaking up on this. I think, as I said, it's medical issues and financial decisions are probably the most difficult for anyone, and they require a lot of thought and a big process. And I can also relate to being at that transition point with your son now, how much there is to do and how overwhelming it can be. So I hope we're not overwhelming you more today, is what I want to say. And really just to kind of appreciate that this is information that can really help to guide that process. So now I'm putting, so I'm speaking from a parent perspective, and how, like Beth, for her, there was a sense of, gee, I didn't know there was an option. Wow, let me explore this and let me think about this. So you should also know, we'll talk about, well, I'm reminding myself now, if we don't remember to say it later, SDM&Y runs monthly information sessions. They're on our website under events. So you can sign up to hear this information again. And then you can bring your son to or your son can come to a decision maker sign up meeting, so that if he does choose to do this, he's also getting the information and he's voluntarily deciding he wants to do this. First of all, I want to say that as supported decision making, it's not a silver bullet. We're also not throwing people out to the wolves. It is supported decision making, meaning that practicing little bits at a time. So perhaps for your son, I'm just thinking about some of the specifics you gave us, that perhaps he wants to be more involved in what his medication looks like, that you have those conversations with him, that he's still relying on you as any 18-year-old or 19-year-old will. My daughter's 32, and I'll remind her, you're the decision maker. Do you want, should we talk about this? Do you want to talk about this? So I think somebody needs to unmute, to mute, please, because it's very hard to hear. Maybe we can mute folks. Andrew, are you able? Thank you. Thanks so much. So I think that specifically, how does supported decision making work in terms of medical decisions? Well, I can tell you stories that we've had with dental clinics in New York City, where the clinic will refuse to treat an individual who is not under guardianship, but has a supported decision-making agreement, okay? Because the climate is changing. So we're in this sort of limbic space where we have SDMAs, the regs, as Jenna said, will be approved very shortly, right? So third parties will have to recognize, third parties also being medical providers, will have to recognize and respect the decisions that a decision maker has made under an SDM&Y facilitated process, okay? So there is going to be that support, that legal support for that. Now, it really, of course, is going to be guided by the conversations that you're going to have as a parent with your son as he learns to be more of a decision maker in this area. On the other hand, with medical decisions, he might for now prefer that mom and dad make all my decisions right now for me. I'll tell you another very quick story of a young woman I was working with who is around that age, the age of your child. And in talking about medical decisions with her and asking questions like, tell me about your doctors. Are you happy with your doctors? And she said, no, I don't like my doctor. And so I asked a little bit more in a gentle way, because, to see if she was open to having a conversation. And in the end, her mom, who was a marvelous advocate for her daughter, had no idea that her daughter didn't like the doctor. So one of the ways that this young woman was going to initiate being more of a decision maker in medical areas was how to choose a new doctor and what that would look like for her. So, I'm just trying to give you some examples of how this can work so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming. Financial decisions. I've had decision makers who have chosen say their uncle who is a financial planner for big financial decisions that they might be making in the future, or how do they use their able account, for example. They might choose their mom for decisions for, on the daily, right? What does the weekly budget look like? How do you want to save and spend your money? Is this helpful to you?
Yes, very much, very much. I mean, mostly primarily the medical, the financial a little bit. I mean, he's received a few checks from programs that he's done through school.
Mhm.
We've put that aside for him in a savings account, and but yeah, primarily the medical stuff. I mean, I'm trying to get around. I guess what I'm concerned about is, where is the line? Say if there's a moment where there's a disagreement about that, medical or anything in general, um and say, the decision maker sort of has a better perspective and view on it. I mean, I understand what Ms. Lamb was talking about with regard to um the right to risk, um
Mhm.
but there are moments where that risk could be very costly. And how do we as decision makers step in to say, I have to override you on this? Um, if or not use it in those terms, but just expressing, look, this could be potentially harmful to you. Of course, explaining all the reasons why. Um,
Mhm.
I guess that's where I'm sort of trying to figure out if there's a line, or
Right.
I don't know if I'm wording it properly, but
No, no, I hear you. And I think the best way to say it is that in many ways, guardianship would not, in the case of a situation where, the hardest piece of this statute is getting medical providers to really buy into it. Because as we know, there are certain ethics that are involved and there are certain processes that are involved. But you hit the nail on the head by saying that, of course, you're going to be talking about all the outcomes and going through all of that scaffolding of information. And I think that that's really the best that any of us can do. Um, and that guardianship is not necessarily going to give anyone any more protection when it comes to really risky medical decisions, right?
Um, yeah, Joan, I do just want to add, because I think Mirandy was also talking about this idea of, what if, as a parent, her
Mhm.
opinion differs from her decision maker on a medical decision. So that is a case where, if the decision maker wants to do something or wants to refuse treatment, and you as their parent would like them to make a certain decision, um, that is the case where guardianship would allow you to make that decision, even if that is not what the decision maker wanted.
Right.
Um, but I think what we are advocating for is this idea that, by having the conversations and talking to the decision maker and having them understand where you're coming from, they hopefully would choose that for themselves. But ultimately, what we're preserving is their right to make that decision about their body in that situation. And everybody, with medical care, there are big decisions that happen and with big consequences. But
Mhm.
it ultimately is, at the end of the day, it is their right to make that decision. And I think that's what we're saying here. But there is also, I do just want to add as well, there was a question about, I think, healthcare proxy. I'm trying to scroll back. It was healthcare proxy and power of attorney. So those do also come into play. We have spaces for that on the supported decision-making agreement. And so if you have a healthcare proxy, we put spaces for HIPAA forms saying you'll sign this with your doctor to give access. And healthcare proxy only applies in those situations where the decision maker would be incapacitated for some reason.
Mhm. And I will note that many, I shouldn't say many, but folks do take advantage of those other instruments that are available that are less restrictive, of course, than guardianship. And those are very personal decisions that families make. Keep in mind that under guardianship, 17A, it is not a tailored guardianship, unlike 81. So unfortunately, one can't choose just guardianship over financial or medical. And so that's where those other alternatives, those other instruments can come into play for some folks. I saw a question, just a very brief question about how do people get in touch with us. We'll show you in a moment. We have a QR code for Contact Us, and that will lead you to the page for signing up for information sessions. It is free of charge. There is no charge to the family. Any other questions come up that I've missed?
There are a couple of additional questions here that I would like to raise. So Linda, who asked about the healthcare proxy, also was asking kind of who monitors the overall decision making of the decision maker, is a question that she wanted some clarity on, I guess.
Jenna, do you want to take that?
Sure. So, I mean, everybody who's in the decision maker's life still has all of those roles. So parents are still parents, and, you know, everybody who is playing different roles, it really becomes this enhanced network of support. It's the decision maker just retaining their right to make those choices, but they still have all their supports and family and friends and neighbors, and it's really
We don't have a formal review process in place, but for the supported decision-making agreement once it's signed. But we're encouraging people to keep it alive by reviewing it, say annually, the way one would have an ISP meeting or an IEP meeting if your person is younger, or life plan meeting, so that because in the future there might be modifications that are made. So on the agreement itself, there are attachments for modifying an agreement, changing supporters, changing areas of support. So there, by keeping it alive, this is meant to be a document that is a living document for people. So that's really an important piece of this also, how to keep the agreement something that people don't just stick in a drawer and actually use for their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So kind of a legal question from Barbara here. She asks, isn't it the case that someone with SDMA who signs a contract is generally bound by the contract, whereas someone with a guardian has the defense that the person could not legally enter into the contract, which she says could be a problem for somebody with intellectual development issues who signs any document that might be put in front of them?
This is one of those questions that we have discussed with the legal portion of our team, and it really depends what you're talking about, what kind of contract. If somebody with, like, we're talking about the theoretical versus the practical. If somebody with IDD signs a contract, signs a check, and the money is gone, you know, like you're not necessarily actually going to court to rectify that situation. So I think there's just an overstatement of the protections that guardianship actually provides in this situation. I think we get questions of if somebody were in a legal situation, if they were arrested, would having guardianship provide more protection for them in that situation? And the answer is practically not necessarily, because that would depend on who that police officer is. What, are they actually contacting the guardian? It's not like a foolproof protection in that situation.
And if we had 4 lawyers on the call, they would all answer this question differently.
Yes.
So thank you for that. So a couple more questions are trickling in, but I'm mindful. So it's like 5 till 11. I wonder if we want to proceed with the slides, and then maybe we can revisit the rest of the questions at the end. Does that work?
Sure.
Yep. So at the end of SDMNY facilitation, what you have is a supported decision-making agreement. It's a signed contract that outlines the areas, types, and sources of support determined by the decision maker in a collaborative process. As Joan mentioned, it's a modifiable document that describes the process the decision maker will use in making decisions and utilizing support throughout their life. During the process, it leads to enhanced self-determination, confidence, and autonomy for the decision maker. And it really does change those relationships between the decision maker and their supporters, recognizing the decision maker as an adult with the ability to make their own decisions with support. So in New York State, as we've mentioned, we have this legislation, which was signed into law last year, and the regulations will be approved very shortly. What we're working on at SDMNY is a statewide service delivery model. We're currently in this pilot period funded by OPWDD. We are here doing our outreach and education. We're connecting with third parties, the medical world, school systems, and also, as was mentioned, I'm working on a curriculum pilot for decision-making with inclusive higher education programs. And Joan, we do also have a high school curriculum that is being piloted by Joan. We're working on advocacy by amplifying the voices of decision makers to protect the rights of people with IDD. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I just wanted to say that it would be useful and edifying. I see, Mirandy, your question and then your comment, to actually look at Article 82 and see how it's broken down, what it actually says in terms of supporters' roles and responsibilities, how it impacts on decision makers and on third parties, because it really does lay it out really well. The regs, as Jenna said, will be out soon. They'll be available for public comment before they are finalized. We're waiting on that. So this is business as usual when a statute is signed. So July 2022, we're going into 2024. This is not at all unusual that it takes a year and change in this case for those regs to be approved. So it's not out of line with other statutes.
Right, and we do have the questions here. I'm wondering if we should show the video of Jessica and then.
Oh, why don't we do that? Let's have you hear from the voice of Jessica, who's a very strong self-advocate, and she went through the supported decision-making process as well. And this is a testimonial that she wrote out. So we'll play this for you and then take any further questions.
Hello, my name is Jessica. I am here to tell you about supported decision-making and what it means to me and many other people with disabilities in New York State. Have you ever made a wrong decision? One where you think back and say, oops, that was the wrong thing to do. Like getting a parking ticket. How did you move forward? Did you learn from it? Or did you stop making decisions altogether? I doubt that. I'm here to tell you that the possibility of making a bad decision or a good or a decision at all is a privilege, one that I want and deserve to have in my life. You can see a person with a disability under guardianship cannot make any decisions, good or bad ones. The mere possibility of making a bad decision strips us of our right to live a full life. A person's life is a collection of experiences, all kinds of them. And I am just like any other person. I want to live it all. Living a full life means that I deserve to have dignity of making a mistake. The chance that I could sometimes forget my umbrella on a rainy day must not mean that I should never be allowed to walk outside. Supported decision-making empowers me to take ownership of my life. It solidifies my connection to a group of people who want to see me move forward. They are not there to hold me back or warn me at every turn. They are there to help me get all the information I need in a way that I can best understand and ultimately support me in the decisions I make. In my case, it also means that my closest caregivers see me thrive with the support of others. They don't always have to be there for me to give me confidence. They know that I can stand on my own even when they are not there available to me. I've done the work of developing these supportive relationships. It is not only right that I can benefit from these deep connections. My team of supporters trust me to be able to make decisions. They believe in my goals and in my capacity to understand choices and take risks. I am a passionate advocate for people with disabilities. I work for the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State and AHRC Nassau. I want to tell others like me that they deserve to be the architects of their life. That needing help from others does not mean that they are not capable of making their own decisions. Supported decision making is a transformational program that makes me feel excited about my future. It helps me take ownership of everything I do. It pushes me to build critical thinking skills. And most importantly, it allows me to be a fully contributing member of society. An inclusive world that truly supports people with disabilities has to let people live life the way they want, to go on their own terms with the support they need to do so.
Joan, you're mute.
I was just about, Jenna beat me to it. I was going to say, as we take questions, we'll put this slide up here so you can scan the QR code for Contact Us and to sign up for, we have a newsletter that gets sent out once a week on Fridays. It's called Good News, and actually on our website, all of our Good News letters are archived. So we have a ton of information and resources and many other videos on the website as well. Please reach out. You can see some of our handles on the right-hand side here. Like us on Facebook, on Instagram, etc. So we are happy to take any other questions that you have. I know that a few things have come up in the chat. So I'd love to address one that I saw that it's an interesting question and it comes up a lot. Can we do guardianship now and SDM later? I would encourage doing SDM first, and things don't work out, you can always do guardianship. Why do I say that? Well, because as Jenna said earlier, getting out of guardianship is pretty difficult. Can be done, but it's a very involved process. We have had some folks who have gone through supported decision-making New York and have actually gone through a restoration of rights process. One of our partners is Disability Rights New York, DRNY. They'll work with a decision maker who does want to restore their rights pro bono. If you go to our website and put in videos, Bobby Restoration, you can hear Bobby's words. Bobby was the first decision maker in New York State to actually go through SDMNY and restore his rights, and he's now quite proud of that. And actually, he was at this New York State Self Advocates Association annual conference. I was presenting there back in October in Albany, and Bobby was present there, and he spoke about what it's like now living as a person, not a ward, making decisions for himself, enjoying the dignity of the risks that are involved. And he talks a lot about the changed, in a very beautiful way, relationship that he now has with his mom and his siblings now that he has had his rights restored. So really encouraging people to kind of flip the way that we think about it, because decision making, our project founder, Chris Booth Glenn, who's the former surrogate judge of Manhattan and was the dean of the CUNY Law School, says a few things about this. And she was actually writing decisions, putting people under guardianship, until the light bulb went off in her head, and she thought, we can do better than this. Why am I putting this person under guardianship? They might need more support, or more specialized support, or different kinds of support, but to take away their human right to be a decision maker doesn't make sense. And is anathema to being a person really in the world, really. So really thinking about what we can do first. So she'll often say, try supported decision making. Judges are now sending people, courts are sending folks our way and saying exactly that. Particularly with folks who are of transition age, parents are coming to us saying, I saw the judge in Queens and I saw the judge in Brooklyn, et cetera. And, they're suggesting supported decision making as a viable alternative, as a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. So I know that was a lengthy answer, but I really encourage people to think about that and what that involves. The other thing is, there was a small question about timing when we take people. 17 turning 18 is a great time. Sometimes people say, well, why not my 16-year-old? I don't want to do guardianship. Decisions become more real for people when they're in those transition years. So it doesn't sound, it sounds like a minute difference, 16, 17 and a half, 18, but it really isn't, because suddenly it becomes more real. What are you going to do after 21 when school's over, right? So 16-year-olds, even though transition age starts at 14, start decision making, start talking about decisions with your loved ones as toddlers, so that eventually we won't need a supported decision making project to get people to think about being decision makers. Other questions, thoughts, comments? Jenna, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I see Mary has her hand raised.
Great.
So.
I do. I'm sorry, I had to jump off at 10:30 to go to another meeting, but I was wondering, is there a fee? Did you discuss that your organization charges to do this legal document for people?
No, there's no fee. It's funded through OPWDD.
Do you need to be OPWD eligible then to use your services, like have a tax number?
Not at this point. We'll have a more definitive answer when the regulations are released.
Which you said is shortly?
Yes.
Which is shortly. But on the state's timeline, but not at this moment.
Well, they have their own timeline. We all know that.
Yes, so we will, but we're either way committed to maintaining access to the program.
Okay. Um.
Did
just
we
an-
call out the chat question with the hospitalization? Linda Joy Grote.
Maybe overlooked it.
No, not yet. This is me, Linda Joy.
Hi, Linda.
Hi. Thanks for calling my question out. I'm sorry that I just have a lot of questions because we have 3 children with special needs. They also are adopted from China and they have complex trauma on top of their intellectual disabilities. And we have 5 children altogether, and our 2 oldest are older than them, adults. And you know, the idea of guardianship is so daunting. We did pursue guardianship for the 2 19-year-olds because they weren't ready to be out on their own. And so now we have that, and I didn't know about this process. And as I put on my chat earlier a minute ago, you know, we were told by the lawyer that if we don't need it, we can just literally just tear it up, you know, and we don't need it. But I believed that, but now I'm thinking that that's not true. So, you know, we've always had this supported decision-making model in our family. That's how we live. And we always try to help them make the best decisions that they can. But this instance of the hospitalization, my daughter, one of the daughters had texted a hotline, you know, unbeknownst to us. I had some surgery and she has very little coping and capacity. And before I knew it, the police were coming up the driveway and in the house and taking her out. I couldn't even respond because I had just had surgery, and my husband didn't know what to do. And so I gathered up the guardianship paperwork and I sent them with it. And, you know, we had no idea what was what. And she definitely didn't have the capacity to understand that she was going to be placed in the ER with adults that are not disabled. It was horrible. I mean, it's horrible, horrible, horrible. And the only reason that I was able to divert that back home again to her back home is with the guardianship paperwork. And you know, telling them that she had no capacity to make this kind of choice. And she didn't, you know, it wasn't safe. So without that, I felt like I was going to be really at risk. Now, the other daughter is much more independent and she could deal with things, but she still has issues that she impulsively does things, but not quite in the same way. So we did that for both of them. And now I'm at the juxtaposition of the next stage where my son is 17, almost 18, and he's by far the lowest functioning intellectually, but he does pretty well overall. And we were right in the middle of the guardianship process. I haven't actually done it yet, but I'm gathering the paperwork and I've done what I need to do. But now I'm stopped with it and I'm like, no, this doesn't seem the right thing. But then when you look at our older children, you know, saddling them with the responsibility of somebody else's life, they almost don't, I mean, it's almost impossible for them to do that. And we don't have a lot of other people, you know, what happens when we're not around anymore? So that's why my whole question came up with the well-being of the person. Who's the overall person? If parents, you know, I hope we live a long life. I'm sure that we will, but you know, at some point, who's in charge? And those are all my questions.
I just want to validate that I hear, you know, the fear, these are really, they can be very intense, scary situations. And that is the peak example of why guardianship is often pursued. And just what I would say to that is, you know, supported decision-making is something that it teaches the skill of decision-making. So that is something that, you know, if you go through the process and your child has talked about, okay, if I have a medical issue, who's my supporter? Who am I going to go to ask for help in this moment? That might have been something that might have come up. Okay, let me
almost a care plan, a
my
safety plan.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sort of it builds that pathway of, I have these big decisions to make. I'm not in a good place. What am I going to do now? And I think that's what guardianship can prevent. It keeps the decision-making power with the guardian and the person with IDD never has the chance to make those choices or develop those skills. So it leaves it in those moments when there is a decision that has to be made. It might not be the most educated decision because they haven't thought about this process, or how would I make a decision for myself? What do I do?
Right.
And
Thank you for pointing that out. I agree with you.
and I just want to say, even from, you ask most 18-year-olds with or without a disability, they are not making the best decisions.
Right, of course.
And parents, if you were to ask my mother, at 18, if she had a chance to continue making decisions for me, if she would have taken that, I'm sure she would have loved that opportunity to have more of an influence on the decisions that I made. This is a worry for parents for children with or without intellectual disabilities. It is universal. It's terrifying when your children grow up and are in this position. So I just want to validate that it's scary no matter what. And that is what we hope that this process really, it just helps to build the skill. And if you look at somebody who's 18 versus somebody who's 28, there's going to be a big difference in their decision-making capacity.
Right.
Right.
It's a growth. Thank you.
It's a beautiful answer, Jenna. And the only piece I would add is a note from the field, because I've worked with decision makers and family members for so long. And this is actually directly from Beth, who you saw in the video before. She talks about now that her son has supported decision-making agreement and is not under guardianship. She said it's absolutely fascinating when she goes to a medical provider with him, how people now, from the receptionist to the nurse, to the nurse's staff, to the doc, talk to Thomas differently now. And that is, I think, the best evidence of why supported decision-making is such a valuable tool. It has an impact on the way people think and perceive an individual. That's all. I think that that's a really important piece to keep in mind as well. I see a question in the chat. Of course, we work with folks older than 18. Our oldest decision makers were in their late 70s. It was a couple, lived in Brooklyn. He is a product of one of the institutions in Maryland. And they had a guardian, one of them had, and the guardian passed on. And they wanted to really experience, they're very strong self-advocates and wanted to go through a supported decision-making process to make agreements.
Wonderful, a wonderful thing. Any other questions while we have these two experts with us?
Yes, hi, this is Mirandy. I actually do have another question. Is the SDMA routinely evaluated? Like, for example, how IEPs are on a yearly and a 3-year basis. Are they evaluated, like, say, on a yearly basis to determine if there's anything that needs to be tweaked or if it's no longer required? That's my question. Thank you.
Sure. So we encourage families and decision makers to review that whenever it feels appropriate to them. We're a resource for families who want to make significant adjustments. There is a modification form attached to the SDMA where you need 2 witnesses to sign that as well, to make those modifications valid. And so that's sort of the modification process. Our goal is to not make it too onerous. It's supposed to be continually relevant and able to be modified.
There's
But-
also talk of having SDMAs reviewed as part of the life plan. There's some individuals that have talked about making that happen. Keep in mind, we've been a pilot for all of this time, and now we have this wonderful grant under OPWDD, and these are things that we are currently grappling with. And as I said earlier, how to keep the SDMA alive, how to encourage people to have a review process. But there's not a formal, we don't have a formal assessment process for people to participate in SDM&Y. Again, it's voluntary. The same goes for there's not an appeal process or a formal review process for SDMAs. The idea being that one of the experts in the world of supported decision-making globally has said, we understand that, and maybe this is a good place to stop, that folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities might not be the best decision makers in the world. But what supported decision making allows for is the opportunity for them to choose trusted supporters with whom they have a relationship with, to be there in their lives, and that the supporters are good decision makers themselves. So again, it's really the conversations you're having with the people that you're supporting, that you are scaffolding the information, that you're going through the different options and talking about the consequences of different kinds of decision making, so that of course there's always going to be risk is part of life. Guardianship or no guardianship, life is risky. And as Jenna said before, can be, I actually had a parent say to me once when they were signing the agreement, I'm thank you very much for all the work that you've done as a facilitator for my son. I'm both relieved and terrified. And I turned to him and said, that sounds like a parent. So it is part of the process of being human, being in this world, and that we have these instruments to allow a person to be a full person in the world, to experience the same rights as any of us do, with support that is good and strong support for the individual. So thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And we will, you have our contact information, and do come visit our website, come to other information sessions that SDM&Y sponsors, and we hope to see you again at another point. Thanks so much.